faith. A lot of very good people see this is see this, okay, recording in progress. See this as a literal embodiment. I think that is not it. I think it is a gorgeous statement. Uh, a poem, a hymn, uh, but however you want to do that, that's up to you. For me, it is a hymn. Uh, it is not biology and it is not physiology. I don't understand Jesus and the whole Jesus thing as as a as we used to say, the three-storied universe. We have heaven, we have earth, and we have beneath the earth. The three-storied universe is the way that is a way to understand it, and it's probably a lot of the way that those early followers of Jesus understood. Uh, for them, heaven was up, earth was here, and hell or whatever was Sheol or whatever it was down. Since Galileo and Copernicus and all of those gentlemen 500-600 years ago, and particularly with Einstein and all like that, we've come to maybe reluctantly agree that there is no up and there is no down. It is here. You don't go up to the stars. You may go out to the stars, but we don't live in a three-storied universe like we used to think. Heaven, earth, hell. We always saying go down to hell, that science does not let us really cling to that idea of the universe. So the idea of Jesus coming down from heaven to be in a body and all does not work for me, and I think for a lot of people. But it is a great song. And it also is a rubric, I think, of how we are called upon to live in the 21st century in Gainesville, Georgia. Uh, it is the song of self-giving. Uh, however you want to understand the work of Jesus, it is very clear to me, I hope it is to you, that Jesus freely invested himself in the lives of the people of Galilee who came to appreciate and love and even adore him. He invested himself in them. And so in that sense, he gave himself to them. And also in that sense, he embodied, in a metaphorical kind of way, the best of what humanity can become. Later on, the Gospel of John, John writes, Jesus says, I am come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. So to me, that begins to get at my understanding of Jesus among them, and really in my understanding of Jesus among us today. Uh, he he offers himself. And then in the course of our responding to him, we are invited, we are encouraged, likewise, to offer ourselves to one another. Uh, uh, so, and that's what it is. What I think it is. How does that sound to you? How does that work for you? Is that uh, bothersome? That approach? Huh? Okay. Uh, this also brings talk about visions. We've talked about this before. Uh, all the way through the Bible and other pieces of religious literature and other way, people had visions. And I have said people still have visions. Uh, I was talking with a friend the other day, and I said, and I've told you before, but I'll remind you of it. Uh, Paul had a vision of Jesus, of the risen Jesus. Now, he did not just have that vision out of nothing. Uh, I am speculating here that Paul from Tarsus, wealthy family apparently. I'm guessing, according to some novels and all that you read, that his parents sent him, his father sent him to Jerusalem from Tarsus up in Greece, somewhere up in there, to Jerusalem to get a thorough education in Pharisaical Judaism, which is as we know from the Bible, a flavor of Judaism. They want they sent Paul to college. What amounted to? They sent Paul to college in Jerusalem. Uh, and from his own testimony, he was very strict, probably rigid, probably was not a very happy camper. He was apparently struggling with himself. He had come from Tarsus, which was a very cosmopolitan Greco-Roman city. Every major city in the whole Mediterranean world had Jewish people living there. The diaspora, Jews by then from the 5th century BCE, had scattered. So Paul was living in Tarsus, probably a strong and probably wealthy Jewish community in this major cosmopolitan city. So Paul had a Greco-Roman echo. He'd grown up in New York City, and then moved to Atlanta. And he was kind of started all over again in Atlanta, maybe, but he never got rid of New York City either. So, that cultural milieu there is a part of the process. So Paul is growing up, young man, 20, 25. We don't have any idea how old he was. And then he looks out and begins to see these little Jesus groups popping up in Jerusalem. By then, uh, I think Jesus had died on the cross. Uh, People who knew and loved Jesus were struggling with why such a good man died, what was God up to, and letting Jesus die like that, all this kind of stuff. But out of that milieu of Jesus' life and death, apparently, even in Jerusalem, these little bitty Jesus groups began to emerge. We can talk about that. There's a lot of fascinating studies on how that happened. Uh, but Paul, see, is moving around in Jerusalem. It's a big town, but it's not huge. And he begins to hear about this Jesus stuff going on. Paul, as a developing, smart, and probably smart aleck young scholar and Pharisee, took offense at these Jesus groups. He saw them, he understood them as being opposed to Judaism. And so Paul talks about this later, that he began to resist and then to persecute these little Jesus groups. So that's me. That's my imagination of Paul's mindset. And then in the midst of this, he says in the book of Galatians and in the book of Acts, Luke says, Paul had a vision of the risen. He had a vision, and he understood that vision to be the risen Christ, the risen Jesus. Now, you don't just have a vision out of nothing, you have a vision out of something. If you have a dream at night, if you can remember the dream the next morning, you can often trace a little bit of that dream to something. So Paul had a vision, and he understood that vision to be a risen of the risen Christ. Now, he'd already heard these little Jesus groups talk about Jesus being crucified, and the word was out that Jesus had come back in some kind of way. Jesus didn't, and if you please, did not stay dead. I don't know any of that, all of that mixture there. But out of that kind of mixture, Paul had the vision of the risen Christ. And then that vision changed his life completely. Uh, and you read the scriptures in there and you feel like it just happened overnight, just in one blink. My persuasion is he had the vision and then he had to work it out. In fact, in one part, he says that he went to the wilderness, he went to the desert for 3 years. This one little snatch of scripture, during which time, apparently, trying to figure out what this whole thing meant. He had these Jesus groups were popping up in Jerusalem. He didn't like them. Suddenly, out of that, he'd had a vision of risen Jesus. He had to deal with that. It was antithetical, and he thought to Judaism. It really was not. But in that mixture back and forth, he began to be concerned about all of that. He was trying to figure it out. Uh, and out of all of that figuring, he became persuaded that the risen Jesus had commissioned him to go tell the good news of Jesus to non-Jews, which was of itself, as you well know, a big break, because Jews did not like, not all of them, but a lot of the Jews did not like to interact with non-Jews. Just, they were some of them, probably the Pharisees of which he was a part, uh, were wanted to be isolated. They didn't want to be tainted by the Gentiles and all that. That's an overstatement. But anyway, so Paul became persuaded that he needed to take the good news to non-Jews. And that's what he did. We know now that's what he did. And this letter to the Philippians is an example of his effort to encourage and support a Jesus group, a Jesus community, probably small group in the good sized town of Philippi. So that's what he was doing there. And so we don't know what was happening. We don't really know what triggered him writing to the Philippians. We said last week, when you read the letter to the Philippians, that you're kind of coming into the middle of the movie. You don't know what all was happening before, but suddenly you're in the middle of the movie and you kind of have to back up and imagine what happened in the first part of the movie. So Paul writes the letter. It's a gorgeous letter. And it's all of that to say, suddenly we're in the second chapter, and Paul is singing this song of the incarnation of Jesus. Paul would be convinced, I'm persuaded, that literally Jesus came from up, down, and became embodied in human form and lived out his calling in this kind of way. I think that's pretty safe to say that this would have been Paul's attitude. Um, and this was standard Christianity for a long time, and in the last 400-500 years, 300 years, we're trying to figure it another way. I mean, not to replace the idea, but to kind of flesh it out, to bring it out more, and also to make it comport with what we know of the universe of these days. We live in a universe that does not have an up or a down. We have a universe that is out there. We're a part of that universe. So what do? We can still sing of up and down. If for me, I need to know the up and the down is a metaphor, it's a poetry, and that there's really not an up and there's really not a down. So that part of it, okay. Uh, so that is a big part of this second chapter here that I think is so important. It is a beautiful poem, beautiful poetry. Uh, and then I'm jumping. Uh, he talks about working out your salvation with fear and trembling. Uh, in the 19th century, one of the great theologians, Søren Kierkegaard, wrote his epic theological book, and he entitled it something like "Fear and Trembling." Uh, Paul says he's working at his salvation in fear and trembling. Was Paul afraid? No, I don't think so. You read the first part of that letter, and you get the picture of a man whose faith was grounded in his experience of the risen Christ. So Paul was not equivocating. Paul was not jumping back and forth. But he was, please, working all of this out. Paul was, and I've talked with my good friend Dan McGee, Paul was developing a theology and a Christology on the run. This was moving, this was developing. Paul knew all about the Hebrew Bible. He knew all about the expectations of the Hebrew Bible. And suddenly, collectively, in over some period of time, he had come to believe that Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus had become the Christ. Jesus had become the anointed of God. That was Paul's kind of bedrock conviction. But then he had to ask himself, being a smart man and moving around and meeting all kind of people, what does this experience mean? So on one hand, very secure in his basic faith. And on the other hand, still trying to figure out what it all meant. I'm in a real wonderful Sunday school class at First Baptist Church. Wonderful group of people. There's a man in there. Anytime something new is said, and a part of what we do in that class is talk new stuff. It's fun, talk new stuff. But this particular man, nearly at the close of every session, says, I've got to have some place to stand. I've got to have some place to put my weight down. Uh, then what he's really saying is all of this stuff moving. He wants a firm yes and no in his life. He probably wants that in every expression of his life. He probably he's a really gentle, sweet man, but he likes all of the corners squared, I'm guessing. If I ever have time, and I've invited him to do coffee with me sometime, I want to try to use this analogy here with him to say, now you have settled your life with God in Jesus. That's who you are. You are a Jesus person. But that does not mean that you know everything about what it means to be a Jesus person, particularly to be a Jesus person in 2025. So I think that Paul is saying in the first century there that he'd had this marvelous experience with the living Christ. He was moving out among Gentiles, among non-Jews, which was a brand new thing for him, even though he'd known Greeks and Romans, but to eat with whoever, all of this kind of stuff was new for him. And the beautiful irony of it was he was seeing these non-Jews turning on to Jesus. They were not in huge numbers, I don't think yet, but in groups, finding resonance with what Paul was saying about Jesus. So, what does it mean? What does all of this new stuff mean? And so I think that's what he is saying when he talks about working out your salvation. I'm almost 88. I'll be 88 in April. And uh, I was teasing, I'm in a men's Bible study on Monday morning, and my time to teach again in that early morning Bible study is on my birthday, on April the 14th. Uh, So I was teasing about that, and I said, you know, this is, and one of them said, well, if you want us to come, you got to bring a cake. And I said, I'll bring a cake. I'll get you a cake when I have to teach again on the 14th of April. Um, what we're still trying to figure out what this means. You got it settled for all of my adult life, since I was 14 or 15. I have tried to figure out what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be, and in these latter years, what it really means to be a follower of Jesus, what it means in this time. Uh, so so this idea of we need fear and trembling fits with me. Uh, and there have been times when I was afraid and come upon new theological ideas. I could be uncomfortable for fear that I was going too far, that I was getting away from God. Uh, but in these last 25 or 30 years, I have settled this basic relationship. I am a Jesus person. And that frees me then to go in all kinds of directions as I try to figure out what it means for Bob Maddox to be a Jesus person in 2025. Work out your salvation. I have the salvation, if you please. Fear and trembling. Fear is awe. Fear is is wow. You know, it's not fear like you're afraid of the getting burned or something. You translate it better. We talk about all the way through the Bible. The Bible talks about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's not a good translation. The awe and love and appreciation of God is what it's all about. So the fear is better translated for me, excitement. And trembling is, gee, this thing's great. Uh, I don't, it's wonderful. Uh, in my writing in the last 10 years, I have come up with the phrase, and it's going to appear again, uh, no conclusions and no boundaries. No conclusions and no boundaries. Uh, and that is to me to say that I can push and think as far as I want to. I can read and study and listen to all kinds of ideas about the faith. Uh, and Okay, that's fine. I don't have to put my weight down there. I know that there is yet more. The more we study the universe, the more that we don't know. The more that we know that we don't know. Uh, and no conclusions and no boundaries. It's wide open. Now I'm settled in my fundamental relationship. I am a Christian in the 21st century in 2025. At the same time, I claim the freedom, the opportunity to internalize, say to myself, and then I'm burdening you with uh, what that means to me. And so you can constantly try to figure out what your own relationship means to you. And you can push and think and listen. And you also want to sift it all. Uh, Paul talks about, or one of them talks about, uh, test the spirit. You don't just jump at everything. You don't just swallow whole everything that comes along. You don't swallow whole, I hope, everything that I say. If Linda was sitting in here, she would say, "Yeah, I'm not so sure about that." You know, I'm glad she's not here because I don't like, I'm saying that it's wide open. It's really wide open for you to go whatever way you want to think, push, imagine, dream, sing, write, whatever you want to do. Uh, at the same time, you can find your place to stand. You can find a bedrock. So work out, work, stay at it, stay at it. Paul did that. I'm persuaded that he never stopped thinking. And we see that kind of unfolding in these letters. The first letter of Thessalonians, all the way through Thessalonians and Galatians and Philemon and Philippians, to the great penultimate writing in Romans. And if Paul had lived, I'm sure he would have kept writing and explaining even more of what he had come to believe in the book of Romans, in the letter to the Romans. So it's wide open. That's what I'm trying to say. And if you want to, you're constantly trying to figure it out. We are constantly trying to figure out what it means to be an American in the 21st century, in 2025. We have to struggle with that. And we have a new administration that is causing me some anxieties. I'm trying to figure out who we are and all of that. I'm also deciding that I can't do much about the White House. I can't do much about that at all. But we can pay attention locally. We have a lot of people in town here who are at least willing to talk about local issues, such things as immigration. How do national policies impact immigration? I don't know. But we have to be paying attention to that. Uh, Early in March, guy come and talk about the lake. He's an expert on the lake named Paul Goddard. And so we are concerned about the environment. Lake Lanier is the center of life in Gainesville, Georgia. You think chickens are. Chickens are very important. But the lake really governs much of the environment. So we need to be aware. We need to keep the lake clean. We need to care for the lake. And Peter can come and talk about that. Later on, I've invited a friend who is a geologist. I may have said this. He's former president of Brunel, who is also a world-class geologist. And he's coming in April to talk about what are these rocks that we live on here? What are these hills that we live on here? And to be concerned about these issues. We're always dealing with human sexuality. Gay people, trans people, married, divorced, kids, all of that. Sexuality is an absolute part of who we are as human beings. It has been for the last couple of million years. So people are conflicted about those kind of issues, and we can begin to deal carefully and lovingly and redemptively with that, with all of these. And we can do them locally because they impact your neighbors and my family and your family. So I'm saying, we are in this together. Okay, you want to chase a rabbit? I've got a couple of more rabbits. The other great line in here for me, and there's so much, is Paul talks about the great race. And he gives us the picture of running the race. The prize of the high calling of God in Jesus Christ, the race. The people of Philippi, being Greek Romans, were keenly interested in athletics, just like we are today. Athletics were a big part of Roman and Greek life. And so when Paul talked about running the race, the people of Philippi would have readily understood that. Whether they had marathons, I don't know how they did it. The Olympics were going on even then. They'd been on for centuries. So running the race, a prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Uh, and as I was working on this, I said, what is the race? What are we racing against? We're racing against ourselves. We're racing against we're racing against the clock. You know, we're getting older. Uh, we're trying to understand who we are, and on and on and on. So we're running this race. It's a beautiful metaphor. Uh, quickly, he another piece that charms me in here is Paul and Timothy. Uh, Timothy came. This is more in the book of Acts. Timothy was not Jewish. I forget exactly. I didn't look it up again. One of his either his mother or grandmother were Jewish, and one was Greek or something like that. Uh, but along the way, Paul met this young man, Timothy, and he saw in Timothy somebody who really did understand what Paul, was trying to do. Uh, and so Timothy and Paul spent, I think, the rest of Paul's life pretty much together because Timothy pops up a whole lot in Pauline literature. We have two books, two small books, two much small letters in the New Testament, First and Second Timothy, allegedly written from Paul, probably not written by Paul. Uh, letters allegedly from Paul to Timothy, telling Timothy basically how to manage the Jesus groups. But they were very, very, very close friends, I'm persuaded, for much of their life. These two men loved each other. Whatever, I mean, I'm sure it was a very, pure kind of love, but they were deeply devoted to each other, Paul and Timothy. Paul also, in this chapter, gives us the name Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus. Uh, Epaphroditus had become a friend of Paul wherever Paul was writing from, jail or wherever he was writing this from. He says thank you for sending Epaphroditus to me. He had meant much to me, Paul says. And then Paul also says Epaphroditus became terribly ill, almost died. Now, this is Paul's language. Epaphroditus almost died. Apparently, he's well again. And so he is saying, I'm sending Timothy and Epaphroditus back to you, back to Philippi. And Epaphroditus, you get the picture, lives there. And so he's kind of going home. Timothy is going to Philippi deliver this letter. I mean, to do, and then to take news back to Paul, whatever was going on in Philippi. So Paul and Timothy and Epaphroditus. I would never name my kid Epaphroditus, you just wouldn't do that. But it's a great legacy. It's a wonderful legacy. We don't know who he was, except he stands out as one that Paul depended on deeply and he was very, very fond of. The flip of that is another piece of irony in here. Paul names two women, Euodia and Syntyche, however you want to pronounce that. Euodias and Syntyche were fighting each other. They were squabbling. They were whatever it was, whether you put the plant here or put it over here, whether you put the water cooler over there, we don't know what they were fighting about, but they were being very disruptive, apparently, in the Philippian Jesus group. And so Paul is urging them to get their acts together and behave themselves. He'd already talked about do the work of Jesus without mumbling or grumbling or groaning, which is very hard for us other mortal human beings to do. I have often said, I don't want to be remembered like Euodia and Psyche. If you have to remember me in some kind of way, I want to be Timothy. I can't be Paul. Nobody go do that. but I could be a Timothy or I could be an Epaphroditus. So I want to be remembered in that kind of a favorable sort of way. Uh, so, that's kind of where we are with that point there. The vision that Paul had, he lived and wrote out of the vision. Uh, he never stopped trying to figure out what this new thing in Jesus meant. He kept at it, pressed toward the mark for the prize of the high calling. There was a letter. There was no crown of laurels out there waiting for him, but he could keep moving. And those are metaphors for me in my tender age of 88 that I don't intend, as long as I can, to stop thinking, to stop reading, and stop writing, and as long as 3 or 4 you show up and listen to me talk, then I keep doing this. I like to do these things together and to talk with you about these ideas. So
it's fascinating.
It is fast. Yeah. We can humanize this in the best sense of the word, to go back to doing our best to try to understand from the Philippian church forward rather than from 2025 backward. And then in the course of that, I think we get a better understanding of what this whole thing is about. So we have one more week next week, and we'll wrap up Philippians next week. Probably go back and recap some of this, but we'll do it. And then I haven't figured out what we might do next. You may have some ideas. I did a little bit of sketching. I've done other things of the Bible uh, so I've got several of those. And then it occurred to me today as I was sitting out there under my lamp to do the Bible and food. So the Bible is full of food. Oh, it's food. And that would be a fun thing to look at sometime, and just as one of our sessions to do the Bible and food. All kind of stuff in there. The Bible in rivers, the Bible in seas. We've done, I think, the Bible in boats. So it just goes on and on and on. Yes.
When you're doing the Bible and food, it's interesting to remember that those early churches were all built around eating. They had communities they'd
right. This is Dan here saying
eating.
these early churches, early Jesus group, the idea of Wednesday night supper or whatever we do.
One more point, Bob.
Yeah. That is a good point, Dan.
One more point.
Yeah.
We're talking about Epaphroditus. Okay. Well, when I was a kid, my father, the pastor, named the dog Epaphroditus. That's the only thing I ever know about Epaphroditus. Try to call the dog, hey, Epaphroditus, come on over. It just doesn't work,
Okay. Whether you can hear Dan or not, somebody in his family named the dog Epaphroditus. So come on, Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus. That's funny there. That's okay. So yeah.
Well, I'd point out that the reason food was so important for the early church groups, early Jesus groups, most of those people were starving. The Romans took all the food.
Yeah.
And all the food went for sacrifices at the temple. Herod overfished the Sea of Galilee to build Tiberias.
Right, yes.
And so fishermen would go out and wouldn't come back with any fish, and so they didn't eat. And so to be able to somehow pull what meager food they had and share it at these Jesus groups was a pretty big deal.
Pete is saying here, I talking more about the meat, the animals offered on altars, and all the food that was often wasted. All of that food was wasted and all. And then that we know that they went through a time of overfishing of the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Galilee. The Roman ruler there was raping the lake there. Okay, thank you all very much. Yes, huh?
Oh, I was just going to say
What
that they took their
Dan, where
property.
Dan lived?
Yeah,
Dan
they
lives
took,
up in the boonies in the Rockies of Colorado,
yeah.
in a little bitty town of 300. I've been up there, and it's a beautiful little place.
Yeah.
Talk about the river. The river literally runs through it. Uh, Dan needs to go to civilization, but he loves it too much up there. Uh, anyway, but we go all the way back. We go back all the way back to Baylor days. So, okay. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you again. Yes, thank you.
Bye-bye.
With Jesus